Welcome to SENSESPACE.
Hey, man. Thank you.
It's good to have you on here. By way of brief formal introduction, author of this wonderful book, Education in the Time Between Worlds. Really cracking book. I read it during quarantine, just as I was kind of conceiving of what this podcast space was going to be. But I really have been more interested in some of the talks I've seen you give with Daniel Forson on his Emerge podcast, where you really get into the more metaphysical, sort of spiritual, integral domains and understandings. So I'd love for us to kind of get into that, because I feel as if with this book you're almost a sage or a very deep thinker disguised as an academic on education. What do you think about that, Zach?
I mean, that's fair enough, except for the last two chapters, which kind of broach all of those topics, kind of open up into that whole discourse, which is where it started for me. I started studying the philosophy of religion and things of that nature. Those were the first serious scholarly books I read, because I had been a musician, and then obsessing with the lives of great jazz musicians, especially like John Coltrane and Sun Ra, and their biographies brought me to Aldous Huxley, the perennial philosophy, the kind of tradition of theosophy with Blavatsky, and then eventually Wilbur. And it was then that I just reoriented directly to the philosophy of religion. That was my first. That's what I cut my teeth on. And then it refined up and into education and kind of psychology as a way to kind of bring these things to bear fruitfully in the world, which is to say, I made a move that many deeply kind of mystical thinkers make, which is actually to turn the work from the self to the world in the domain of education in particularly, which is to say to teach, but even more deeply to think about the institutions and technologies of human transformation. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about that stuff if you'd like. That seems to be what most people prefer to talk about.
Well, the educational stuff is really fascinating as well. It's a very comprehensive and deep sort of blueprint for reimagining the structure of education, but also the understanding of it and so forth. But yeah, it does feel like you're kind of part of a collection of quite independent thinkers who show up in specific domains, but actually their systems of understanding within themselves, they've kind of worked to understand at the cosmic level. They've tried to build a meta model, and a model that is kind of an experiential, embodied kind of understanding of the whole world, but then kind of channeling into this thing that shows up in your book.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, some of them call it metatheory, but it's just good philosophy, like what you're describing.
Yeah, there's a sense I get in the way that you talk about philosophy and ideas in this kind of deep and slightly alluring, it kind of feels like you're just revealing a little mystery is just on the other side of whatever's being talked about. And as I kind of said to you about your last appearance on Jim Rutt, I really felt like I could just viscerally see and experience that dynamic of the questions were kind of this, and then you were kind of not being quite in the container that was there. So, and I feel that this is kind of a characteristic of these integral embodied thinkers, is like they show up in the containers, you know, in the think tank or in the podcast about a specific topic, but the nature of what's being talked about has always kind of got this underlying sort of symbolic resonant structure going on, which is reflective of the experience of the world that those thinkers are having and that you're having. So I kind of want to bear into that a little bit and just hear about like how this philosophical journey has informed your experience of the world, day-to-day relationships, etc.
Can you ask a more precise question? What do you mean? That's like a huge question.
Yeah. Let's see. What were the sort of, you talk a lot about expanding the human potential. When we're reconceiving of education, it's not just that we're changing the curricula or even the institution or the understanding of it. It's kind of transforming into something which is more like a philosophy and relationship to the world, which is a learning relationship. And that kind of process is going on at the deepest level, and continuing all throughout life. I know, sort of for me, a lot of this process of sort of delving into trauma, coming into mystical experiences, doing kind of spiritual developmental practices. The way that this stuff is most meaningfully showed up is not in like a set of ideas that I have. It's more about the way that I'm experiencing the world, like what I'm perceiving from my environment as I move through it.
Right. Totally. Yeah, I mean, I've said, I think on Thorson's podcast, that the place you cash out your sense making is in your life, right? In the immediate context of the choices that you make, and specifically your ability to care and to love, I think. And so that is worth noting, that you don't cash out your metatheory in a published paper. You don't cash out the metatheory in a debate on social media. That the metatheory sense making cashes out in your choice making, immediate choice making. So in that respect, that's one of the ways you know you're doing philosophy or not, or earnestly or not, is if you refuse to commit things like performative contradictions, which are statements you can make from a podium or in text, but which you can't actually make the basis of coherent choice, right? So classic example of that is to assert there is no space of reason, there's only power, right? So it's kind of like the postmodernists giving you their arguments about how rationality doesn't exist. But then if rationality doesn't exist, you can't make arguments, right? You just assert power, in which case you should not talk to me and try to convince me about the absence of reason, but just simply exercise power, but the reverse to the exercise of power, right? So there's this performative contradiction. If you go too radical postmodernist, same thing with relativism, right? But there's other things like the absence of free will, which a la Sam Harris cannot be maintained without committing performative contradiction. So you can say these things, but when you actually form the coherent basis of your choice and the context of early childhood socialization, they're actually not coherent basis for the life world itself. So this is just to say that, yeah, philosophy, it's one of the differences between philosophy and other disciplines, actually, is that there's a root in the primacy of one's own choice, as opposed to the root being in the viability of it, working in certain informational ecosystems, right? It needs to work here at the root of the will and the choice first. So it's good to bring it back around. And then to bring it back around, not to what are the ways of thinking that are rationalizations or that make me feel good, but rather the ones that align oneself with reality, and again, provide the conditions for the possibility of care and love, right? So again, that shapes the nature of the theories and reflections that one can get into as a philosopher. Are those things not primary? So for example, if you are kind of strictly adhering to, let's say, certain forms of Buddhism that have a strong monastic tradition, then certain kinds of relationships, like marriage, for example, wouldn't be seen as actually the right cauldron or container for spiritual practice. This happens in a monastery. But from another perspective, well, that you're actually leaving the playing field of life to go do a spiritual practice. Whereas the argument I'm saying is actually, no, it's in the immediacy of our relationships where the playing field actually exists. So any philosophical or human growth or spiritual ideology, meditation practice that would actually have you negate the story of your life to find kind of a pseudo freedom, again, rife with performative contradiction and difficulty. So I'm kind of speaking into the space of your question, and then if you get more specific, like as a philosopher operating on the special sciences, dealing with psychology, neuroscience, education, things like that, dealing with a media ecology and digital media landscapes and guys like you. And it's like, so like, how do you look at all the different information feeds, right? And how do you decide, as you were detecting in my speech acts, when you're in a particular frame, how do you decide to act within that frame as far as when you're putting out information? And so we can get into that too, which gets back to this issue of a kind of transdisciplinarity and a post-paradigmatic way of operating as an intellectual. So that's kind of like a fork away from the immediacy of my lived experience. Gets into the kind of noosphere kind of intervention.
So you're kind of stepping into a frame, but there's a place where you're coming from, which is not the frame.
Well, like when I was in graduate school, it was a very constrictive language game of specialized academic knowledge work. And I was obsessed with comprehensive integrative meta-theories like Ken Wilber's and Roy Vescar's and Jürgen Habermas's, Charles Sanders Peirce. But those moves, like the 4 quadrants, Wilber's 4 quadrants, which is like a massively useful, parsimonious model for getting at the true complexity of complex systems. You're not allowed to just bring that in and slap it on the table and have everyone consent to it and start to get them to play the integral language game, right? So instead, what I started, and this is what I would say I was doing in graduate school, is that I make integral moves in non-integral language games, right? So it's like you're aware of the kind, this is what it means to be post-paradigmatic. You're aware of the paradigm that you're in, which isn't just a set of ideas, a paradigm. That's actually wrong. Kuhn actually talked about it much more specifically as being both ideas and their experimental operationalization or behavioral operationalization. So the paradigm's an embodied thing. So you have to be aware of the paradigm that you're in, but then also be aware, well, it's a paradigm. And you can look at it. And the subject becomes object, to use Keegan's language. And then you can make moves from within the paradigm, which are just novel by comparison to what you would do if you weren't aware that you were kind of in the paradigm. And now this can be done in a deconstructive way, which is the basic move the postmodernists make. So you can blow up a paradigm by getting post-paradigmatic awareness. But more mature post-paradigmatic awareness ends up being trans-perspectival. So it actually is not seeking to blow up the paradigms, but to actually bring consilience among them. Kind of acting more like with teacherly authority within the paradigm. And then working as like a plenary shaman, kind of moving between the paradigmatic tribes, trying to overcome the ethnocentrism of the disciplines. So that's some of the way I speak, and it makes me a dialectical speaker, which means that like if I'm talking to someone who's like spiritually oriented bias, that I'll bring up hard science and like, you know, brain science and kind of logic. But if I'm with someone who's like a hard scientist and stuff, then I'll bring up like spiritual stuff and, you know, the things that subvert the law of non-contradiction and the limitations of Western science, stuff like that. So to work in the paradigmatic context, almost always a little bit against the grain, to try to surface in the people you're talking to the paradigmatic assumptions and then to liberate them from the paradigm, right? Is the goal, as opposed to try to win an argument within the paradigm. Like, that doesn't make any sense because you're aware of the limits of the paradigm. So you're freed from the simple notion of the kind of game theoretic within paradigm dispute and getting at a higher level of trying to bring consilience between paradigms, which means both limiting them and freeing them. And so that means when you're in conversation like with someone like a Jim Rutt and he asks you a question about religion and stuff, you choose your words super carefully because you're aware of the paradigmatic biases operating within him and within the viewers and et cetera. And so you try to work within that language game to say something that usually isn't said within it. And then that's a novelty instead of just coming with the response that's usually expected, which is like some over spiritualized language or some irrational commitment to a set of the efficacy of certain practices and things of that nature. So yeah, and that again, it's both a psychological capacity development issue and a schooling disciplinary issue as far as the people who kind of operate this way. It's not just hierarchical complexity in the Hansi Freinachian sense, although it is that. It's also the relationship to schooling in specific and disciplinarity and training within the disciplines. So my experience has been that people who can, again, go post-paradigmatic and trans-perspectival, as I was describing that capacity set, tend to have been not good students traditionally. So they weren't habituated into, again, this ethnocentrism of the disciplines or the deep paradigmatic biases. They were always kind of strangers among the well-schooled, and as I was. So it's also like an embodied socialized attitude towards institutionalized knowledge, combined with a certain amount of hierarchical complexity and then some breadth and opportunity of study. Something like that. And luck.
You're totally resonant with my experience of the academy as well, a little bit. Sort of during my master's, when I was trying to do like a very comprehensive, integral approach to Islam, basically, and I found there were real kind of hidden constraints within the bounds of the discourse within the field, but also with the academics I work with, and I was kind of looking at the IDW and Brett Weinstein and like trying to bring in like ideas about memetics into this thing, and
In
it just
graduate school? No.
didn't show up at all
Right.
on the radar. And I have to say, there's something very, I have a weirdly strong association between you and The Matrix. I know Ken
movies in
Wilber was
Matrix?
involved with The Matrix too, so I'm wondering if,
Me in the Matrix? That's
yeah, I
great.
know.
What about me in the Matrix? I'm curious.
Something stylistically, and also something about the philosophy kind of has a little bit of a anarchic rebellious flavor, but it's also like a kind of red pill, like moving into
It's funny.
another mode. But I do think that that's actually how there's an extent to which you begin to experience the world in a much stranger way once you adhering more towards truth and love. And as I'm saying it, I'm conscious of the new age and very papery kind of understanding of that. And what's very important about the way that you've spoken about that is that you associate it with the tragic. And so there's always this holding of the tragic in relationship to the kind of transcendent or loving, and it has to be kind of integrated. And so and I know you've spoken about this a little bit already, and that's where I heard about it, but it landed quite meaningfully for me when you talked about kind of the pre-tragic stage and then the kind of tragic and the post-tragic, and this sense of like being in the tragic and then hearing that kind of from you was very empowering and useful, because you can get a sense of like you're moving between stages, and there's also this like recognition that the larger the larger the weight of sort of forces that you're working with in your life or with trauma, it seems to me the case that the more you're working with and integrating, the more power that resides on the other side of it. But it's not a kind of power that you possess. It's more like an exuberance. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, more like a kind of chi, watery kind of thing, which is acceptance of the way things are increasingly, and moving through the world on that basis. And you talked about kind of one tends to come into more kind of empathy when one drops into one's own trauma or connections to the widespread disconnection in the world today, or just in most people's developmental backgrounds. So yeah, throwing those pieces out.
Yeah,
because
it's interesting.
It's very, very meaningful to me, this whole area, and it's really where the metaphysics of love or eros that you talked about in your paper, the name of which, Love in a Time Between Worlds, on the Meta-Modern Return to a Metaphysics of Eros. Really awesome paper, really liked it. It's kind of where that meets reality, and it seems to me to be perhaps the crucible of self-transcendence.
Totally. I mean, there's a lot in there. I mean, first, the Matrix bit is interesting, right? I mean, only insofar as that the Matrix is like one of the great kind of like one of the great mythic structures of our time and epoch. And so, there's a way that any any really transformative educational experience can have a liberating quality to it, which is that quality of like what you meant, the red pill, or just like waking up and realizing that the suppositions you used to have are not a given, and that there's a much bigger kind of story or game that's actually unfolding around you. And so, and this is often part of this move from the pre-tragic to the tragic. So like, when wake, well, a few things. One is that simulacra and simulation, right, by Baudrillard, who's a French postmodernist. This is the book that Keanu Reeves, Neo, takes off the shelf during the very first scene of the very first Matrix when he comes in, simulacra and simulation, which is basically about this notion that there are levels of simulation that unfold as society becomes more complex, and that in late stage capitalism, we're at a deep kind of what Baudrillard called like a level 4 simulation. And this was before the internet, right? So I think the other thing to get at here when you're talking about like things I'm saying, like the Matrix and stuff, is that, one of the things I'm definitely saying is that read your Baudrillard and then look at Facebook and social media and the kind of digital media landscapes in general, and think about the nature of simulation as opposed to reality, and get back to reality. But that what that is often moving from the pre-tragic to the tragic. So when Neo takes the pill and wakes up and pulls a thing out, and like it looks around and he sees all the pods and he realizes what's going on, that's the beginning of the tragic, right? He was in the pre-tragic, then he moves to the tragic, and so the post-tragic move in the Matrix doesn't come until the absolute end. Like literally the last few minutes, when there's going to be a bringing together of when the little girl and him are speaking as the new world kind of emerges, and there's this sense that they're going to try to do something different to kind of blend the unity of the light and the dark, as opposed to continually warring the light and the dark. Anyway, so the Matrix is deep and cool. And Ken Wilber and Cornel West actually did a commentary over the Matrix on the box set that the Wachowski brothers put out, which was pretty awesome. So the pre-tragic, tragic, post-tragic. So technically, because I heard you say there's stages, technically they're not stages. Technically they're what could be better called, I think, stations. And so there would be stages, phases, and stations as developmental phenomena. Stages being very hard and structural, like the model of hierarchical complexity. Phases being looser, sometimes called soft stages, like Erik Erikson's work. And then these stations being like Kierkegaard and others who are looking at these, and some meditative models, which can occur at any stage or in any phase. But they're transformations of consciousness that reconstitute the meaning the identity holds about what it's going through. And so, crisis of faith, returning to faith, those kinds of things, and not seeing tragedy, only seeing tragedy, being free within tragedy. Like, right. So these movements of the kind of stations of consciousness are different than meditative, liberating states like Satori. They're much more kind of like closer to what I would call ensoulment, or they're in the domain of personality development. And the one that I talk about the most, which you put your finger on, this move from the pre-tragic to the tragic, and then from the tragic to the post-tragic. This is a lot of what the kind of real pain and confusion in the culture, a lot of it revolves around these stations and people being at different points in these stations, basically. So I'm glad that you've found that useful. And in fact, the kind of mythic structure of tragedy, I've also suggested, is one of the roots, kind of one of the root metaphors or root archetypal frames for being a person. Like that, that this is death being, of course, the greatest example of the unavoidability of having there be tragic framing or tragic structure. And then other things too, basic physical limitation and, kind of like non-synchronous or asymmetric potential to actuality. Like there's a whole bunch of things that are woven into the fabric of the human experience that would have life, at least in part, be about grappling with tragedy. And so that's another bit of the kind of basic philosophical or meta-theoretical framing that I work with. Is that we need to have philosophical languages that allow us to grapple with those kinds of things, or we're not like working seriously and in earnest. So, and remaining in the tragedy is not actually a true grappling with the things, because you can't go on with just the tragic mindset. I mean, that's kind of some of the worst you've seen of the most cynical postmodern kind of views and nihilistic identity formations. These are ones that see only tragedy. And that's an easy position to take because it's one that's kind of often foisted upon us by the culture. Because ultimately the tragic position is also one of a certain kind of helplessness and a certain kind of disempowering and a certain kind of humility and a few other things that make it so that it's important to get that lesson of actual tragedy. But then you have to find, again, a way to transform that to be re-empowered within tragic contexts and to make meaning within tragic contexts. So while the culture will get you to seeing the tragedy, and in fact will show you more and more tragedy, and many more people are exiting the pre-tragic into the tragic, the culture has a kind of ceiling effect where it's not going to then get you out of the tragedy up and into ways of grappling with and meaning making, in the tragic context.
Yeah, it seems this. One thing I like about the stations idea is that it seems more clearly something that you can be moving. You could go up to station and then back to base camp, and
and you can be at any level of complexity and have not gone through any of those stations, right? Which is to say, you could be super smart and actually really developed on a whole bunch of parameters, but not had enough situations in your life demanding you to confront tragedy to actually get through tragedy to be post-tragic. Like, there hasn't been the opportunity. Whereas some people get post-tragic like when they're 15 or 10 because of the nature of the tragic life situations around them, force them to find those adaptive capacities and reflective abilities to have a post-tragic identity, and not all post-tragic identities are good, but they're different than tragic identities, and especially from pre-tragic identities. But they have some similarities with pre-tragic identities because there's humor again, there's levity again, often. There's a sense of power and agency again, in a sense that it matters again. You're hard to find often when you're embroiled completely in the tragedy. But the post-tragic humor, laughter, power, meaning is post-cynical, post-naive. It's a whole bunch of things that demarcate it as distinctly different from the naive, pre-tragic. So Yeah, so there's a lot to work with within the stations models, and there's more stations than just those three. And which is to say, there's kind of like different phases, different stations of consciousness that can kind of click on and off depending what you're encountering in your life. And then, of course, there's states of consciousness, which we haven't talked about. So when you get into the meta psychology, you start to see a real multidimensionality and
Yeah.
a polyvocality, which is to mean many voices and many persons within the individual psyche.
Yeah, multidimensional is exactly the word that was
right.
I was thinking of, and I really liked learning about hyper objects from you. And I don't know if I've been playing with the concept far outside of the bounds, but I've really just used it as a catch-all for kind of multidimensional phenomena like consciousness. And I don't know if you would.
So that's not technically that's not the correct way to use the term hyperobject, because multidimensional stuff has been around for as long as there have been humanity. But hyperobjects have specifically to do with the exhaustion of science itself, which is to say that science begins to detect through its sensors and methods objects that then transcend the ability of the sensor and method to exhaust it, to capture it, and then of course of our minds to be able to fully capture it. Mm-hmm. So like primitive man was like looking out at the rainforest, and it was like beyond comprehensionly huge and complicated, but it wasn't by Morton's definitions technically a hyperobject, because the hyperobject is objectified through technical scientific instrumentation. And then it's exactly the precision and complexity and kind of sheer quantity of the scientific attempt to get at it, which still fails, which then reveals the hyperobjectness of something like climate change is the classic example, but other things too.
So hyperobject is more like the kind of constraining view towards the complexity that's already there.
Yeah, and the hyperobject is also the kind of like epistemological embarrassment of modernity. That all of the most complex scientific instrumentation we could possibly develop brings us up to this point of being like, oh, yep, no, we don't totally get it. Like it's beyond our comprehension, and we tried with all of these instruments and all of these other things. So there's there's an epistemic humility that kicks in, and there's a cognitive embarrassment, and again an exhaustion of the kind of kind of a hypothetico-deductive, quantitative kind of modern way of doing science. So it's important to get that the hyperobject is very much about this particular historical moment of scientific success, basically. That like the success of the massive instrumentation, like global sensor network, like late capitalist scientific techno juggernaut, like the success of that thing was to point us at the hyperobjects. Look, this thing is way bigger and more complex than we can possibly even begin to comprehend. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't the potential, again, for a new paradigm to emerge where the complexity of sciences are actually made good on, and the hyperobject stops being embarrassing and starts being something that we actually set up our whole apparatus to go on an endless learning journey into. The embarrassment of the hyperobject is a result of having an expectation for a certain kind of knowing and a certain kind of predictability being the basis of what counts as good knowledge. But when you get that expectation out of the way, then the hyperobject becomes something much, much different.
Yeah. I get a sense that when we talk about multidimensionality or multidimensional objects or trans-paradigmatic things, it's still very often coming from this very heady conceptual notion that it's going to be kind of, straight lines and graphical kind of objects. Whereas my sense, and I think is probably reflected on the emphasis on emotional work within your writing, is that the move to multidimensionality is actually the move from disembodied in the head and just kind of stuck in like this container that you can't see the edges of, down into the body. And in some sense, the body or embodied cognition, your capacity to really sense the space around you is where the multidimensionality occurs. And this is just utterly, like, it's a really heretical notion for me to say that dance is actually a primary, one of the most important kind of tools for coming into attunement and understanding of reality, and being able to explore like really subtle textures of thought and of perception in the world. So I wonder, SENSESPACE from the start has been very kind of wrapped up in my own shift from disembodied rational new atheist many years back to kind of more embodied and more in the emotions and more in relationship to mystery, I guess, and having a sense that there's we can say conceptually that there are things beyond what we can think of, but the actual way that we conceive of those things that are outside of the container seems to me to be very much an embodied sense kind of quality. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, it's got to be both, right? I mean, you can dance all day, but if you don't know calculus, you don't know calculus. You're not going to learn calculus by dancing. And you need calculus to do certain things. And similarly with argumentation and philosophy and things of that nature. Generally speaking, like there is in the transition to post-conventional identity and exiting what's sometimes called tier one, or in dialectical levels, hierarchical complexity levels, abstract systems into single principles, at that phase shift, which is usually late adolescence or early adulthood. Wilbur noted this in his first work. There's a move where the ego, which to that point had been disidentified with the body, which had been kind of a floating signifier, begins to start to integrate with the soma, that the psyche and the soma come back together. And so that's just kind of the case. Now, that doesn't always happen. The resolution of the adolescent identity complex can occur in such a way that you have a disembodied identity for an extremely long time. But there's a natural kind of tendency for increasing maturation and ego identity integration to bring along with it this re-embodiment that you're describing. But I don't want that to, that co-occurrence of those things isn't that the embodiment then necessarily makes you more abstract, complex thinker. It's that as you're developing, that's just this natural part of the maturational process. So this is just to say that although embodiment is extremely important, and I would never say it's not, it is not, it is nothing like the rigorous work that's needed to build the mind itself to the point where it can grapple with the complexity of complex intellectual challenges. Now, you can bring the mind to the point of grappling with complex intellectual challenges, remain completely disembodied, and you've cut yourself off from a whole realm of extremely important information. So you've made yourself stupid. You put yourself at a disadvantage. But vice versa, if you only work on embodiment, you've put yourself at a disadvantage in terms of intellectual capacity. So once you start to see that the work is basically, the building of the unique self unfolds across all of these different dimensionalities, then you can reflect on what's happening to you as you develop and grow, and you can think reflectively about it. But the problem and tendency is to focus on one thing at a time, and that's developmentally sometimes appropriate. But the ideal thing would be to have some minimally comprehensive suite of things that you're working on as part of the ensoulment, development, and transcendence that you're kind of living into, if I can put it that way. So embodiment, totally, but also read some books, and also learn to control your mind and create metacognitive contexts, like through meditation or stuff. So I'm usually balancing that out. So if you had been like, hey man, let's just read books, I'd probably have said something like, well, what about embodiment? But if you come to me and say, hey man, embodiment basically is the most important thing, then I'd be like, no, it's not true, because there's all of these books. Right? So that's, again, the dialectical thinking. And the idea is that you do the dialectical thinking before you speak and kind of bring more complexity to everything that's offered is the goal. That it makes it harder to speak, and also harder to be understood. The demands of communication go up, but we're going to have to get used to that. So yes, embodiment, totally. And it's, it's key, and it's neglected in our education systems as well. So that's worth noting. Totally.
Yeah, even down to sitting in desks for 8 hours a day in straight lines.
Oh yeah, and we're cutting gym class and a whole bunch of stuff. Even nutrition, medicine, things of that nature is also ranked under the body. I mean, the neurotic fear of disease is an issue of embodiment. So it's not just about can you move and are you flexible and things of that nature, but it's also about what is your relationship to the processes of your own body, the natural breakdown, the natural cycles of sickness, defecating, eating, all of that shit, so to speak. Like that's embodiment. We confuse it with like yoga and stuff, but it's actually like, are you in your body? If you're in your body, then you actually know you're going to die. And that's actually one of those points that was about the adolescent identity complex, which is that it's about the same time that mortality dawns on the young adult. That's about the same time that if everything's going well, the ego becomes re-embodied. But before that time, it's like a seemingly immortal, omniscient, powerful, disembodied idea, the identity, the young adolescent identity in particular. That's why there's so much risk-taking, because they've got this big neocortex. They can project all of these abstract notions of who they are and what's possible, but they have no embodied sense of what is actually possible. And then they don't have any experience usually. Again, if everything's going well, there's not a lot of experience with illness, with limitation, often not even with tragedy for most adolescents, many adolescents anyway. And so then it's, again, the notion that, oh, Jesus, I have limitations. I will get sick. I will die. I will not accomplish everything I set out to do. People I know will die, who I love. All that stuff clicks in. That's part of what it means to be embodied.
Yeah.
It means to know that you're going to get sick, to know that you have limitations, to know that you will die. So that's important, because sometimes embodiment is actually just a fetishization of the body by the disembodied identity. So like weightlifters and stuff and anorexics and people obsessed with physical appearance and things of that nature. That's not actually embodiment. That's a fetishization of the body by the disembodied identity. Embodiment is coming to terms with what it means to have a body, be in a body, and to live as the body, not to work upon the body as an abstract project, right, from a space of disembodiment, which is a lot of what the fetishization of the body in our culture is about. So yeah, there's a lot in that. And there was a return, of course, to the body in postmodern philosophy in general. Lakoff and Johnson, philosophy in the flesh, I think it was. Foucault, the move in the cognitive sciences. So I'm right along with you there, but I'm being contrarian and saying, yes, dance, but also read.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Before I follow up on that, I just want to check logistically.
Yeah, I need to go in a couple minutes.
You got to jump off in a few minutes. Okay. Yeah, just to, I guess, wrap things around loosely. He really just embodied the Zak Stein move and the sort of trans-paradigmatic complex move of kind of like, yes, embodiment and reading books, but also what does this word embodiment mean? Like you've kind of come down to brass tacks of the thing in itself, and then just like sort of exploded that out into in a Heideggerian sort of fashion, just like brought it out into everything that it can be. So this was awesome. Thank you for coming to SENSESPACE, Zach. And I hope there's some collaborative conversations to come.
Totally, man. This was fun. I wish you the best of luck with this.
Awesome.